Before we begin, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe and like the video. It really helps us share real history and bring important stories like this to more people. The Holocaust in the Baltics. A history of destruction, collaboration, and memory. The Holocaust in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, was one of the most rapid and devastating chapters of Nazi Germany's campaign to annihilate European Jewry. Between 1941 and 1944, approximately 200,000 to 250,000 Jews were murdered in this region. In some areas, entire Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were almost completely wiped out within months of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The story of the Holocaust in the Baltics is not only one of German occupation and systematic genocide, but also of local collaboration, resistance, rescue, and the long struggle over historical memory. Jewish life in the Baltics. Before the war. Before the Second World War, vibrant Jewish communities flourished throughout the Baltic region. In Lithuania, Jews had lived since the Middle Ages, and the country became a major center of Jewish religious and intellectual life. Vilnius, often called the Jerusalem of the North, was home to prominent scholars, including the renowned Vilna Gaon, and was a focal point of Yiddish culture, publishing, and education. In Latvia, Jews formed a dynamic part of society, especially in Riga and Daugavpils. They participated in commerce, crafts, industry, and cultural life. Jewish political movements, Zionist, socialist, religious, operated openly during periods of independence between 1918 and 1940. Estonia had a much smaller Jewish population, around 4,500 people before the war. In 1926, Estonia granted cultural autonomy to its Jewish minority, a rare progressive measure in Europe at the time. Jewish schools, associations, and communal institutions functioned freely during the interwar period. Despite occasional anti-Semitism, the Baltic states during their independence years were not sites of systematic anti-Jewish persecution. That situation changed dramatically with the onset of war and occupation. Soviet occupation, 1940 to 1941. In 1940, following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the Baltic states were occupied and annexed by the Soviet Union. Soviet rule brought repression, deportations, and nationalization of property. Political leaders, military officers, and members of the intelligentsia were arrested or deported to Siberia. The Soviet occupation created deep resentment among segments of the Baltic populations. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, many locals initially greeted the Germans as liberators from Soviet rule. Tragically, this political context contributed to the rapid escalation of anti-Jewish violence. Nazi propaganda falsely portrayed Jews as collaborators with Soviet authorities. While some Jews, like members of other minorities, had worked in Soviet institutions, the claim of collective Jewish responsibility was a myth used to justify persecution and incite violence. The German invasion and the Einsatzgruppen. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union. Within days, German forces advanced into the Baltic states. They were accompanied by mobile killing units known as the Einsatzgruppen. These units were tasked with eliminating perceived enemies of the Reich, primarily Jews, but also Roma, Soviet officials, and others. In the Baltic region, Einsatzgruppe A, under the command of Franz Walter Stahlecker, was responsible for implementing mass murder. Unlike in some parts of Western Europe, where deportations to camps came later, in the Baltics the killing began almost immediately. Mass shootings became the primary method of extermination. Jewish men were often arrested first under the pretext of security measures. Soon, women and children were included. Entire communities were marched to forests, pits, or ravines, forced to dig their own graves, and shot. Lithuania. Rapid annihilation. Lithuania experienced one of the highest percentages of Jewish deaths in Europe. Of approximately 220,000 Jews living in Lithuania before the war, about 90 to 95% were murdered. In June and July 1941, even before German administrative structures were fully established, local militias and nationalist groups initiated pogroms in places such as Kaunas. The infamous Lietuvos Garage Massacre saw Jewish men tortured and killed publicly. German forces encouraged and documented such violence. One of the most notorious killing sites was Panerai, near Vilnius. Between 1941 and 1944, around 70,000 Jews, primarily from Vilnius and surrounding areas, were murdered there, alongside Polish intellectuals and Soviet prisoners of war. Victims were shot and buried in mass graves. Ghettos were established in major cities, including Vilnius and Kaunas. Conditions were harsh: overcrowding, starvation, forced labor, and constant fear of actions or mass deportations for execution. Yet even in these circumstances, cultural and spiritual life persisted. Schools, theaters, and underground resistance movements operated inside the ghettos. In 1943, the Vilna ghetto was liquidated. Many residents were sent to labor camps in Estonia or deported to extermination camps in occupied Poland. Others were shot at Panerai. By the end of the war, only a few thousand Lithuanian Jews had survived. Latvia, ghettos and massacres. In Latvia, about 70,000 Jews lived before the war. By 1945, fewer than 5,000 remained alive in the country. After the German invasion, mass killings began swiftly. In Riga, a ghetto was established in October 1941. Jews from smaller towns were also concentrated there. Conditions were brutal, and forced labor was widespread. The largest massacre in Latvia occurred in late November and early December 1941 in the Rumbula forest near Riga. Over 2 days, approximately 25,000 Jews from the Riga ghetto were marched to the forest and shot. The killings were carried out by German SS units with assistance from Latvian collaborators, including members of the Einsatzgruppen. Later, Jews from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia were deported to Latvia. Some were housed in the German section of the Riga ghetto, others were murdered upon arrival. Outside Riga, mass shootings took place across the countryside. In Liepaja, hundreds of Jews were executed on the beach. Photographs taken by German soldiers document these atrocities, providing chilling visual evidence of the crimes. By 1942, most Latvian Jews had been killed. The remaining few were exploited as forced laborers in camps such as Kaiserwald until they were evacuated or murdered as Soviet forces advanced. Estonia, a Judenfrei territory. Estonia had a small Jewish population before the war. When Germany invaded in 1941, many Estonian Jews managed to flee eastward into the Soviet Union. Of those who remained, around 1,000, most were killed by the end of 1941. Estonia was declared Judenfrei, free of Jews, at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, making it one of the first territories in Europe to receive that designation. However, Estonia later became the site of labor and concentration camps for Jews deported from other parts of Europe. Camps such as Vaivara held prisoners under brutal conditions. Many were executed or died from disease and exhaustion. One of the worst massacres occurred at Kalevi in 1942, where thousands of Jews deported from Central Europe were shot shortly after arrival. Local collaboration and complicity. The Holocaust in the Baltics involved not only German perpetrators but also varying degrees of local collaboration. Auxiliary police units, militias, and volunteers assisted in identifying, guarding, and killing Jews. Motivations varied. Some collaborators were driven by anti-Semitism. Others sought revenge against perceived Soviet collaborators. Still others were motivated by opportunism, coercion, or career advancement under occupation. It is important, however, not to generalize entire populations. Alongside collaborators, there were individuals who resisted, helped Jews hide, or joined partisan movements. Resistance and rescue. Jewish resistance in the Baltics took multiple forms. In ghettos like Vilnius, underground groups formed to organize armed resistance and escapes to forests. The United Partisan Organization, FPO, in Vilna, sought to prepare for an uprising. Although a full-scale revolt did not occur there, many members escaped and joined Soviet partisans. In Latvia and Lithuania, Jewish and non-Jewish partisans carried out sabotage and fought German forces in forests and rural areas. Rescue efforts, though limited in scale, did occur. Some local families hid Jews at great personal risk. Others provided forged documents or assisted escapes. Several individuals from the Baltic states have been recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem for saving Jewish lives. The return of Soviet rule and post-war silence. By 1944, the Red Army had recaptured the Baltic states. The German occupiers retreated, often evacuating camps and killing prisoners to conceal evidence. Under renewed Soviet rule, public discussion of the Holocaust was limited. The Soviet narrative emphasized the suffering of Soviet citizens rather than the specifically Jewish dimension of the genocide. Mass graves were often left unmarked or labeled generically. Jewish survivors who returned found their communities destroyed and property confiscated. Many chose to emigrate in later decades, particularly after restrictions eased in the 1970s and 1980s. Memory and controversy. After independence. When Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania regained independence in 1991, the question of historical memory became central. Each state faced the challenge of acknowledging both Nazi and Soviet crimes. Museums and memorials were established at sites like Ponari and Rumbula. Educational programs expanded, and research into the Holocaust increased. At the same time, debates emerged over the role of local collaborators and the commemoration of nationalist figures with controversial wartime records. Balancing national narratives of Soviet oppression with honest confrontation of Holocaust participation remains an ongoing process. International dialogue and scholarship continue to shape understanding. Conclusion. The Holocaust in the Baltic states was marked by extraordinary speed and brutality. In Lithuania and Latvia especially, centuries-old Jewish communities were almost entirely destroyed within a single year of German occupation. Estonia, though smaller in Jewish population, became both a killing ground and a site of forced labor camps. This history underscores the lethal combination of ideological hatred, state power, war, and local collaboration. It also reminds us of the courage of those who resisted or chose to save others in the face of terror. Today, the forests of Ponari, Rumbula, and Kalevi Liva stand as silent witnesses. Beneath their soil lie the remains of tens of thousands of victims. Remembering their lives and understanding the complexity of the events that led to their destruction is essential not only for honoring the past, but for confronting hatred and intolerance in the present. The story of the Holocaust in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania is not only a regional history. It is a chapter in the broader human story of how civilization can collapse into genocide, and how memory, however fragile, strives to preserve truth against the erasure of time.